Representative J.T. Wilcox, let me have you up on stage, the House Republican leader. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here. Let me say first, as I've done before, but I think it's always important to call out this kind of leadership, that we live in a time of Me Too politics and some rancor from left and right, and I think that you are not yet through your first year as leader, but I would just commend the way the House Republican leadership nudged Representative Manweller into retirement. I thought that was a commendable act, and I would say that to Representative Harris, with I'm sure other people's support, nudging Representative Matt Shea out of his leadership position, someone who had called for, said it was appropriate for people to be killed based on their religious beliefs. I don't think he was advocating that. I just think he was trying to explain a political point. So thank you for your legislative leadership there. Let me ask you, I think that's worth a round of applause. For those who follow those legislative issues closely, that was admirable. Introduce yourself. What does a J.T. Wilcox Republican look like?
That's the second time you've pulled that question on me, and I'll give you the same answer. I'm just a guy that has an unusual job in Olympia. What I think I really try to show my caucus whenever I can, I've been in Olympia for about 8 years, is that none of us are experts on anything but a very narrow topic there. And so you try hard to listen carefully, learn at an amazing rate, and whenever you're in doubt about how to behave, this is one place that rewards you for being honest, trying as best you can to resolve conflicts, and every time you have a conflict that isn't resolvable, talk to both parties and make sure that they understand what you're going to do and why you're going to do it.
You made a statement about Frank Chop's leadership as Speaker. You want to just comment on things maybe that you've learned as a legislator or now as a party leader in the House from watching his role as Democratic leader?
Well, Frank doesn't come out of his lair very often, so it's a slow process to try to learn what Frank does. But one of the things that I think he has been very smart at is he has figured out what are the small in number but most important levers of power to pull in Olympia. And he controls the agenda. I think that's the source of most of his influence in legislative work, and he's a master at working with various stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that Frank has, I think, that is not always apparent is he's a charming person and capable of being friendly. And he also knows how to reach out. And one of the things that I really appreciated about him is after I was first elected leader towards the end of last session, he came out to my home. I live on a farm with a lot of my family and spent about 4 hours there, and we had a really good time. And he and I are people that work hard at heart, and both of us have grown up working with our hands too, so we've got that in common.
Tell us about what you expect to be, what will the 2019 legislative session look like when we are writing the session in review stories come hopefully in April and not in June. In April, the session in review will say what about 2019?
Well, I just got done with the AP forum this morning with the other caucus leaders, and it was amazing how few people were willing to make any predictions. But I guess my prediction is that we're going to have some kumbaya moments when it comes to mental health, some aspects of school funding, and then we're going to have really big fights about taxes. Mm-hmm. And I think in the end, the Democratic majorities are going to vote for some increased taxes. It may not be the ones that are on the table right now, but they're also going to find that it's hard for them to get votes for tax increases even from their own caucus. Yeah. But you're going to talk to someone after me that maybe has a little more insight than I do.
Let me ask you, I mean, the Republican Party is pretty well established nationally and locally as a party that is for limited government. Often that takes the form of being opposed to some taxes or many taxes. What do you make of the argument that Washington State has a regressive tax system that actually inhibits small business growth like your farm and makes it hard for folks to actually stand on their own 2 feet?
Yeah, I think that there's several ways to look at that. First of all, I think it is true. It's hard to argue with the fact that the Washington State tax system is somewhat regressive for people. It also, at the same time, is considered to be one of the highest business tax states as well. But most taxpayers don't think about whether or not their tax system is local or state level or federal. They think about the total bite. And we also live in an environment where we've got a very progressive federal income tax. And so when you look at people, especially that are professionals and in small business, often they will have a marginal tax rate in the 25 to 35% range. And on top of that, they'll have a 15 or close to a 15% self-employment tax. And then they will see whatever the state is doing. And I think that's one of the reasons why the state has also generally been pretty opposed to progressive taxation like an income tax.
We talked in the 2011-2013 biennium about, we use the term bow wave, that the spending in the Gregoire administration, which had a lot of bipartisan support, but particularly Democratic support, was outpacing the means of the state. And then we hit a recession, and we, again, with bipartisan support, slashed and burned everything. I mean, that's hyperbole, but those were gruesome days in that 11-13 legislative session. It feels like we're on the front end of an economic slowdown. We may not be as bad as then. What do we do as a state, as a legislature, to make sure we don't run into that kind of slash and burn moment of the 2011-2013 budget session? Make sure we don't hit that again.
Yeah, well, that is especially resonant with me because I was elected in 2010 and then sworn in 2011. I was the only freshman on what was called the House Ways and Means Committee then. And the first vote that I ever took was on a supplemental budget that was the biggest all-cuts budget in the history of Washington. And the hearings for that were brutal and at times verging on violent. And what became so very plain at that time is after a relatively long-lasting economic growth period, the legislature was seized with the idea that it was going to go on forever, and people had unmet desires for legislation, and so they piled on everything that they possibly could and spent every bit of the resources that were available, and started a lot of new programs at the same time, all of them with positive motives, with the motive of trying to help people. And then we went through this period of gruesome adjustment, and who got hurt? The people that needed the most help. And to me, if we really, really care about the health of Washington and the health of people that are the most dependent on government, our first imperative has to be to make sure that when this growth period, that's the second longest recovery in the post-war history of the United States, ends, we have a soft landing so that we can maintain the services that are absolutely necessary now, and we don't end up having to balance the budget on the backs of retirees, university students, and the most helpless people among us, as happened in 2011. To me, when I've heard the governor talk about the moral imperatives that he recently was talking about in some of his press conferences, I go back to that and think to myself, there is nothing at all moral about what happened then. And it was because we had no discipline in 2008 and 2009.
The Republican Party nationally has a brand. The Northwest Republican Party in Oregon and Washington in particular has, I think, a different brand. While Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell may embody sort of the national brand, I think the Northwest brand is embodied by folks like Dan Evans and Joel Pritchard and Slade Gorton and Mark Hatfield and Bob Packwood down in Oregon. Different kind of Republicanism. You are one of the 2 or 3 most important Republican leaders in Washington State. What advice would you give to the president about how he should govern?
Yeah, he sort of ambushes you with that question. You know,
Thanks for being here. I hope you come back next year.
I've reflected on that overnight, and in watching some of the coverage of the negotiations going on right now, I guess I was struck with something that was just so absolutely sad to me, that after an unsuccessful negotiation in the White House, every single person who made a press statement there did nothing positive except, well, absolutely nothing positive. Every single party just stuck out their finger at the other side. And we try hard not to do that in Olympia. It happens sometimes. The press gets frustrated because we will do budget negotiations and everyone will come out of the governor's office or one of the office buildings and they won't talk about things. That honestly is the right way to do it. And the worst way to do it is to be blaming immediately, because you burn so many bridges. And I think one thing that happens is people from the business world don't always understand that a negotiation in the legislative world is somewhat different. You have to deal with the same people year after year after year. And when you burn a bridge, it can be burned forever. The other thing that happens in legislative negotiations is it's a lot easier to walk away. In business, usually the people that start a negotiation really want to close it. In politics, sadly, right now, often the safest thing to do is to walk away and go tell the base that it was your opponent's fault. And if we're ever going to get out of this, we've got to have leaders that are willing to tell the truth to their supporters as well as their opponents, and also have the guts, I think, to absorb some blame rather than immediately trying to blame somebody else.
JT Wilcox, House Republican leader. Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you. Appreciate it.